Okay, so this is our reading group on Ruyer's book Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We are picking up from page 43 of the translation, and this is should be the last session on chapter 1 of the book. So the title of the chapter is The Main Types of Information Machines. And so he's essentially going through the different ways you can use information to or the different ways you can set up a machine that uses information in some way. And of course, in some sense, every machine involves information. Like whatever machine you're building is going to, in some sense, respond differently to different types of things. Even if it's like, I don't know, a pulley, like this extremely simple machine, it will either be able to lift something or not be able to lift something, and depending on how heavy it is. So you could say it's like, in some sense, responding differently to the weight of the object to lift. It's sort of in a sense taking in information about how heavy this object is and responding differently. But of course, how useful it is to describe the machine in terms of information will vary depending on what type of machine it is. So in the case of the pulley, it's probably not that helpful to describe it as like taking in information about the weight of the object to lift. But in the case of like these anti-aircraft guns, for example, that we've talked about a few times, it's pretty much essential to understand the reception of information about the trajectory of the object to target. Like you can't really understand what the machine is doing unless you sort of take account of this information reception function. So at the time he's writing so the first edition is 58, I believe, in the 50s at least. There are, of course, digital computers, which we're familiar with from today, but there were a bunch of other types of information machines that were also in use. So you had these analog computers that were still quite prevalent at the time. So in an analog computer, it's rather than having like a set of bits with a 0 or 1 value, you have a continuous signal of some kind. So a lot of them at this time would have been electronic analog computers. So if you're trying to model, like if you're trying to have a computer predict what the tide will look like at a given time, you would have some sort of electric circuit set up in such a way that the changes in the electric current would sort of correspond in some way to the level of the tide. And so if you want to know what's the tide going to be, at I don't know, 3 p.m. on December 22nd, then you would like sort of run your electric circuit to or set it to the right sort of parameters, and then you would measure what the level of the current is at that time, and then you can use that to predict the level of the tide. And then another sort of example of this that he mentions here is this network analyzer system, where you have like you want to model the operation of an electric power network. You have like different power plants, transmission lines, different like maybe factories or other big facilities that are drawing a lot of power from the system, and then you want to sort of model what happens if one of the power plants is damaged or one of these transmission lines goes down or whatever. And then so you can sort of simulate that in your analog system. It's like a scale model of the real system, and then you can sort of predict, what will happen. What are the best ways to respond to this kind of event happening, and so on. So this is like it's still an information machine in the sense that you're interested in this machine not because of the actual sort of physical effect it produces, but for what it tells you about something else happening in the world. But it's not a digital computer because it doesn't involve this discrete 0-1 sort of operation. But what they sort of share, what's common to these types of machines and all the information machines that Ruyer talks about is that they kind of they abstract from anything like a human interpretation or understanding of a situation. So like your network analyzer is just a physical system with current that flows in different ways based on the design of the system. And then the human who is operating it or observing it or measuring it will then sort of understand the system as like providing information about the functioning of the actual power grid out in the world, but the system itself is just a set of circuits through which electric current flows. It doesn't itself have any understanding of the power grid that it's supposed to be a model of. And for like the the cyberneticians that Ruyer is talking about, they essentially want to explain the human capacity to understand things in general, and also other animals' capacity to understand things in terms of these information machines, or like modeled after these information machines that are not themselves capable of understanding. So if we want to understand how it is that a human can, look at this network analyzer and use it to learn something about the electrical power grid, and make decisions that are appropriate to the conditions of that grid, then we have to sort of analyze the human nervous system and brain and so on in terms of these of similar types of information machines that do not themselves exhibit understanding. And so Ruyer goes through a bunch of like sort of increasingly sophisticated forms, like and more of these the ones that have these more cybernetic sort of design that involve like feedback loops and sort of dynamic equilibrium, where you have these in some cases quite simple systems where you set things up in such a way that the device sort of exhibits something that looks like goal directed behavior. Like he talks about this sort of artificial tortoise that behaves as if it were an organism that seeks a charging station to ensure that its battery stays charged, but also to avoid light that's too strong. And so it sort of simulates like a simple kind of animal behavior that you might observe in a worm or something like that, that seeks out food sources, but also wants to avoid potential dangers and has to balance those competing impulses. And sort of the cybernetic project was that you could like take these sort of simulations of simple animal behavior and just make them sort of more sophisticated and more complex, and eventually you would capture all the most sophisticated human behaviors. You'd be able to sort of build up these feedback loops and dynamic equilibrium processes to eventually produce a device that would compose symphonies and write novels and whatever, all the things that we consider to be some of the most sophisticated human behaviors. And so Ruyer, I think, is like skeptical of the sort of empirical feasibility of this project. He doesn't really think that this is something that is going to succeed, but he's also sort of insisting on like an in principle difference, that even if you did produce an artificial device, like an information machine that was capable of sort of simulating or reproducing human behavior in these like more sophisticated domains, it would still not like it would not be the same kind of performance as a human being performing these activities. It would be just a simulation, or like a simulacrum of the human performance. And I think this is especially interesting today when we think about like you have these like automatic translation functions that are actually pretty good at this point. You can take a text in French or German or whatever. It's the quality varies depending on the language and how much content there is on the internet for it to use, of course. But you can take a text and feed it into DeepL or Google Translate or whatever, and get a pretty decent translation in English back within a few seconds. Even though, of course, this machine, this system, is not doing anything like a human translator, where the human translator sort of understands the text in French and then generates a text in English that is has a similar meaning. The computer translation system is just based on this sort of probabilistic analysis of like this sequence of words in language A has like a similar statistical distribution as the sequence of words in language B, and then it just sort of generates a text that matches these statistical properties. It has no like there's nothing within DeepL that does anything resembling understanding the text in question. And yeah, so the question that the sort of like core question of this book, I think, is like, can we assume that this sort of increasing sophistication and more and more sophisticated like pattern recognition functions in these information machines is sort of will eventually sort of capture what a human is doing when they understand a text or piece of music or whatever. It is just sort of a quantitative difference between our existing information machines and human capacity to understand intellectual or semantic properties of something, or and this is Ruyer's position, or is there a difference in principle or a difference in kind between these kinds of asemantic or non-semantic manipulation of information that machines are capable of, and then the semantic capacity to understand something that a human exhibits. So, I mean, I think to some extent there's just a sort of like insistence on a principle. Like you can't really. I'm not sure there's a way to give like a good argument to say yes or no that whether you can understand this human capacity to to understand something or to grasp the significance of something in terms of these like intrinsically meaningless information manipulation operations. I think it's sort of like a decision you have to make as opposed to something you can like give an argument for one side or the other. But anyway, so that's what we're going to be looking at throughout this book. And so the first chapter is essentially just going through all these different types of information machines and sort of pointing to where their weaknesses are, I think, or like where they sort of don't quite show us what a lot of these cyberneticians wanted them to show us. I think is what he wants to do in this first chapter. Okay, so we can pick up from page 43 at the 43 at the top of the page, I think, is where we were. If someone would like to read from there.
Yeah, I can read. It is clear that a simple self-regulating automaton only appears to imitate the quote-unquote law of effect. The thermostat seems to be looking for a given temperature. Once this temperature is reached, it seems quote-unquote satisfied, since it maintains it. A DCA cannon with radar also looks for its objective until it has obtained the quote-unquote satisfactory effect. But for one to be able to talk about learning or conditioning, this quote-unquote satisfaction would have to concern the means and not just the goal. The living being knows how to find the most expedient means. Quote, pressing the bar, unquote, for the rat is an act, quote-unquote, valued through success. A secondary automation must then necessarily be superimposed on the primary automation so that the machine imitates the living being. The secondary automation would itself work on information, but on statistical information about successful moves. In short, it would be able to induce. However, as we have seen, induction machines, without being inconceivable, are very difficult to realize. Not to say that it is extremely doubtful that this would be authentic induction and therefore true learning. The problem might be a little less difficult if it were not a question of quote-unquote satisfaction and induction, but of a simple application of what Thorndike calls the, quote, law of exercise, unquote. The influence of repetition, quote-unquote recency, and quote-unquote frequency. A law which is, in fact, far from being unanimously accepted today. Wiener, again, probably not satisfied with the aforementioned hypothesis and relying on recent research from the Eindhoven laboratories of the Philips Company, gives a general idea of what automatic learning based on this law could be. If I call a colleague or a close friend 20 times a day, automatic telephone, the procedure for the call is just as complicated as that for calling an occasional correspondent. A living being in a similar situation would soon find faster alternatives for the often repeated action. It would be necessary then that the apparatus of the automatic telephone records the relative frequency of the numbers called and modifies its own assembly through second-degree feedback for the, quote, most frequent calls, unquote. We appreciate the extreme difficulty of mechanically making a device that modifies itself in the other than by simple mechanical wear. Simple wear can sometimes be equivalent to improvement, but the running in of an engine, the softening of new shoes, or the increase in capacity of a battery after use cannot be considered to be authentic cases of learning. However, cybernetics does not give up on tackling the problem, even in cases where induction is necessary. Take again the DCA cannon with automatic aim. To avoid projectiles, the targeted aviator will modify his line of flight, but he cannot modify it ad libitum. He is dependent on the centrifugal force and the characteristics of the aircraft, which prevent him from making very sudden turns. A human aimer would get used to these evasive moves and would shots accordingly. However, a device can also do this by feedback of the second degree, superimposed on the automatic functioning of the first degree, and functioning with statistical information of the most common evasive moves of the aircraft. Another conceivable method of approach for the problem of learning has been attempted. It starts from the fact that a negative feedback can be more or less efficient. That is, it can stabilize its oscillations more or less quickly. Certain systems can only be stabilized following their test by at least two feedbacks, not only one. An auxiliary feedback can test the characteristics that it would be necessary for the principal feedback to have in order to render the system stable in a given circumstance. This is equivalent to a sort of learning. One can take, for example, the way we behave when we walk or drive on an icy road. All our ways of walking or driving depend on our knowledge of the degree of adherence of the road, or in other words, of some, quote, oscillatory characteristics, unquote, of the pedestrian road system or car road system. If we drive with the authority of our usual manner, going into the ditch. So while driving, we make a series of small steering movements, insufficient to make the vehicle skid dangerously, but sufficient for us to be continually informed of how the vehicle is responding. We then adapt the way we drive in response. A, quote, feedback informing a feedback, unquote, can be added to an automaton. It is, however, doubtful that it is a matter of true learning here. It's only a matter of an automatic choice between two pre-existing assemblies. Maybe I'll stop there. So I guess in terms of the argument of the book, he's trying to show here that mechanistic cybernetics has trouble explaining learning. Some of these examples do seem a little bit dated to me. I don't think it is, difficult to automatically change, for instance, like an Instagram feed on the basis of feedback from, what the user is, the post the user tends to engage with. Obviously, that curation is automated and seems to be the kind of second order feedback that Ruyer here seems to think is not, although he may still insist that, for reasons other than what he seems to see as like this empirical impossibility, it still, is not authentic learning, although I'm not sure what exactly his argument would be there.
Yeah, so like I was mentioning in the sort of intro part, that there's sort of two types of argument that he is making here. Is so one is just the empirical argument that there are these phenomena that that humans are capable of doing in learning that machines are not capable of, and of course the domain of those kinds of human learning capacities that machines are not capable of has gotten much smaller in the time since he was writing. Of course, we have machines that can learn how to identify pictures, in some cases better than humans at this point. Identify a voice from a recording, or to identify the words spoken in a recording. Pick out music, like of course we have Shazam that can identify what piece of music is being played and so on. So all these kinds of learning tasks that at the time he was writing were of course far beyond the capacity of these information machines that existed, are today like things that you can run on your phone, that you carry around in your pocket with you at all times. So yeah, the sort of like empirical argument is probably a lot less convincing today than it was in the 1950s. But then there's this sort of in principle argument that even if you suppose that these information machines, so if you suppose that you would have like an information machine that would exhibit the same kind of general learning ability as a human, that you would sort of insist that no, this is still just a simulation of learning. It's not the same kind of thing as what humans are doing when they learn. Yeah, so it is. I think the more sort of general these kinds of learning abilities become, the less convincing that position is. Like I think part of what he's sort of focusing on is the fact that these even the existing learning types of process or something like learning that machines were capable of at the time he was writing these sort of inductive machines that he's talking about. They were like learning or a simulation of learning in a very limited domain that like you would be able to sort of input trajectories of airplanes and have it figure out what the likely it would learn I guess like what an airplane trajectory looks like. But if you tried to input like music or chessboard configurations or whatever, it would just like give you an error message or I don't know, blow up or something. I don't know. Um, it would have no way of like sort of taking its capacity to learn airplane trajectories and then like applying that same capacity to chessboard configurations. Whereas of course a human can to varying degrees learn both airplane trajectories and chessboard configurations and millions of other things. So I think as more general learning capacities come to be realized in machines, it starts to be less less convincing to think that what these machines are doing is it is not sort of in some sense learning, or it is not learning in the proper sense. It's just a sort of simulation of learning. But at the same time, I think it is worth sort of recognizing that even our much better learning machines or machine learning systems that we have now are still generally pretty domain specific. So like you have an image recognition, you know, machine learning system. If you start trying to input music into it, it would just be like the wrong file format, or it would give you some bizarre results where it would like try to interpret an audio file as an image and of course produce nonsense. So like yeah, we obviously have much better machine learning now than we did in 1958 or whatever. But it's still generally pretty domain specific, and there is not, even the things like ChatGPT that in certain respects are pretty sophisticated. They're still only limited to specific domain types of learning. And like ChatGPT can't learn how to throw a frisbee, for example, because it doesn't even have a body to do that, right? Or even if you tried to get it to control, a robot arm or something, it's just not trained on the type of data that would make that possible. So yeah, it the sort of empirical gap between what machines are capable of learning and what humans are capable of learning is still there. It's just that it's maybe less it's less obvious because we have these more specialized machines that are capable of either in some cases better than human performance in specific tasks, in other cases like pretty good approximations to human performance, in others of course especially in things that involve like manipulating physical objects, the performance is still pretty far from the level of humans. In and I think I remember seeing something about like Amazon warehouses where they have these like sort of like giant sort of warehouse shelving stacks, and you have a robot that sort of retrieves things, but like the sort of last step of like picking up the object is still something that humans are better than this sort of robotic retrieval system at performing, because the types of objects that you might have to pick up are so varied that like a robot that is good at picking up I don't know, a book would not be good at picking up a T-shirt or a coffee mug or whatever. Like all the like thousands of different things that Amazon sells, humans are capable of using the correct grip, strength, and orientation, whatever, to pick up these objects. But like still today, that there's no robot arm controlled by a computer that is like capable of picking up all these different types of objects as well as a human. So yeah, there still is this empirical gap. Despite the obviously much better performance in learning compared to when Ruyer was writing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. One thing I was thinking of when I was reading that section, we can, I think, easily imagine a program some like digital calling service that would learn how frequently you call certain numbers and I don't know, like recommend like most frequently dialed numbers to you when you open up the application or whatever. But as an example of like this kind of semantic gap, I guess, like, you can imagine a situation where you had some issue with your bank, for instance, for like a couple of weeks, and you were calling the bank as frequently as you were calling your partner. Um, and then if you finally get the bank issue resolved, for you, it may be sort of completely behind you and in the past, no longer the number of the contact at the bank is no longer relevant to you, but for the application which recommends what it assumes to be like important numbers on the basis of like call frequency, the bank number may still be like equally as important as the phone number of like your partner or your family or these other contacts which have much greater and like significantly different like affective weight for you. I don't know, just thinking of an example that might not rely on this empirical deficiency, which is no longer really accurate. And maybe another example is like Facebook will like recommend that you reach out to people who have passed away because like you haven't reached out to them for a while, but obviously your relationship to them is not just like a certain like frequency of contact and qualitatively changes significantly away. So, but it's just the program is completely ignorant or agnostic of these aspects.
Yeah, I think those are interesting examples. So the phone app one, yeah, you can, it's completely within. I mean, I don't know of any phone app that does this, but it's completely within the realm of like what is technically possible today to have the phone app, you know, see how often you call people, and then suggest, oh, do you want to call X when you open the app because this is the person that are likely to call, and it could even be more sophisticated, like at a certain time of day you're likely to call this person, uh like and all the like music streaming or YouTube and all these apps do stuff like that like they evaluate not just like are you likely to to watch this video, but like are you likely to video at this time of day after having watched this other type of video, etc. So like all these like sort of statistical analyses of what type of person or what type of profile is likely to watch this type of video, based on its the past history of the profile, the time of day, all these location, all sorts of other bits of data that it can evaluate. So yeah, this is like obviously much more sophisticated learning than the kinds of things that Ruyer was familiar with. But at the same time, it's still very like shallow learning. So this like bank example, maybe over the course of a couple weeks, you are calling the bank like 5 times a day to try to get those problems solved. But then after that, you have like no reason to call the bank anymore. And so like your relationship to the bank has changed, and having the phone app suggest the bank every time you open the app would be kind of annoying. I think maybe the like cybernetician could respond that, oh, you just need like a second order learning process to add on to the first order learning. So you would not just sort of look at how often you call these different numbers, but also like is there like a pattern, like if say like you never called this number for years and then all of a sudden you're calling it like 5 times a day over the course of several weeks and then stop calling it, maybe that's like a statistical pattern that indicates that you are interacting with this phone number for a specific purpose, and then rather than or as opposed to say a number that you call several times a week over the course of many years, which would indicate like a different pattern, that this is someone that you have like a long-term relationship with of some kind, rather than someone that you interact with to deal with a certain problem. So maybe it would treat those numbers differently, and sort of drop the first number down your like recommended numbers list faster than the other number that you call on a frequent basis over many years. So yeah, you could have like more sophisticated forms of learning that would not just sort of give like a list of most frequently called numbers, but would look at like what is the pattern of calling this number over time, and treat numbers differently depending on whether there's like a concentrated burst of calling this number many times in a short period, or like a sustained um, you know contact with this number over a long period of time. So yeah, I think even that probably would not really be like beyond the realm of technical possibility. If you wanted to design an app to do that, I think it would be possible to do that today. Um, but of course, like any sort of I guess any sort of like preset form of learning that you build into your app will eventually sort of reach a limit where it will still do something like pretty dumb because it doesn't understand your like it doesn't have any real understanding of what kind of relationship you have with the person on the other end of the phone line. You can make it more and more sophisticated, but you eventually will reach a limit where it will like just not yeah, it will make a prediction that doesn't make any sense, and that any human would say this is like not a good prediction, just because it is like only relying on the statistical properties of your interactions with this phone number, as opposed to having some sort of grasp of the value of your relationship with this person or significance of your relationship with this person. And yeah, so like the Facebook example of like suggesting you send a message to someone that you know is dead, like that's a you know a pretty good example of like making a suggestion that doesn't make any sense and might actually be pretty like harmful to the person who receives it. Like, oh, do you want to send your dead partner a message on Facebook? Yeah, so um, yeah, again, so you could obviously have like a better like if Facebook decided that they were like not didn't want to make that kind of suggestion, that would be pretty likely to get like people to either leave Facebook or send angry messages to the Facebook administrators or whatever. Maybe they can develop some sort of more sophisticated learning that would figure out that the person is dead and not suggest this person to their contacts. But again, like that's just one. Like it would be kind of like a band-aid solution where you could keep sort of building on more and more complicated like learning processes to like plug these holes that come up as you implement or as you like have this learning system sort of being applied to the Facebook network. But at each time you would sort of plug one hole, there would still be like other holes that you hadn't thought about that would you'd only sort of find out about it when people complain that like the this learning system is learning something that it should not learn, or is like making suggestions that don't make any sense. Kind of an aside, but there's that Black Mirror episode where there's like this company offering a service where they will like reproduce your dead partner's like online interactions with you. That they sort of like scan all your emails and texts and whatever with this person, and then like produce a sort of like simulacrum personality, and you can continue the conversation with this dead person. And I actually just heard recently that there's a company that is offering this service now. I suspect it's probably not very good at this point, but yeah, so you can like hand over your dead parent or dead partner or whatever, like their email inbox to this company, and then it will like compose emails from this person to you, based on learning, I guess, like the writing style and whatever of this person. I don't really understand why someone would want to pay for that service, but yeah, so it's yeah, you can imagine Facebook 5-10 years from now maybe like rolling this out as like just sort of an automatic part of the what they offer as as their social media platform, right? That it would sort of constantly analyze your posts and messages and so on, and then when you die it would just keep posting in your name, and no one would even know that you're dead necessarily. Like, I don't know, people that I don't know, friends from high school that you haven't actually interacted with for 20 years, that whether this person is actually like enjoying their brunch at some restaurant you never heard of, or whether it's just like Facebook generating a post that resembles what they would have posted if they were alive. Like, it'd be hard to tell from from a distance with someone that you've never talked to in years. So yeah, it's yeah, exactly. Like I was thinking exactly of that. So in the William Gibson novel Neuromancer, there's this uh, simulation of the personality of this dead sort of hacker that like yeah they sort of like analyzed the I guess behavior of this person and produced this like automated replica of the person that is sort of used to guide the main character of the book and the so this like simulated person or this replicated person at one point compares himself to a phantom limb that he says it's like his whole existence is like this missing thumb of the person that yeah Dixie Flatline, yeah, that's the character's name. So he's like talking about how he knew someone who had a missing thumb and was had the missing thumb was itching and he couldn't scratch this missing thumb, and he compares himself to this his whole existence to this phantom limb, itching missing thumb, and his reward that he asked for helping with this project is to be deleted. So yeah, it's a very strange circumstance, but it's not I think that far from where things are now. It's not impossible to imagine that something like this could exist in a few years as like a widely available service, or even something like I said that Facebook decides to roll out to everyone. So yeah, I don't know how we're going to, as a society, how we're going to handle these like digital ghosts that like replicate an existing person that is dead. But yeah, something that I think that Ruyer would have probably found pretty disturbing.
Yeah, along those lines, you see people. I haven't tried these websites, but they are like AI, supposed to be like AI simulations of, you know, famous like intellectual figures or actors or celebrities. And of course, the things that people share on like Twitter, for instance, are things that the AI has gotten like grotesquely wrong or just, seem completely uncharacteristic. Which is yeah, it just kind of goes to what we're talking about with the inability to it may get some things right, but the inability to kind of plan for all eventualities, and obviously these simulations making mistakes that the actual figure would not have made.
Yeah, because like so, say you want to have like your conversation with Albert Einstein or something, and like you can so I don't know ChatGPT or maybe you have like more specialized tools that would sort of analyze the corpus of writings that Einstein left behind. But then if you ask it like what do you think about Donald Trump? Of course, there's not going to be anything in the Einstein corpus that you can use to make that assessment. So the computer has to just sort of make something up, and there's no reason to think that it would actually produce something that is like a realistic, production of what Einstein might have said about Trump. It might decide that Einstein would really have loved Donald Trump and would think he's a great guy. So yeah, like these sort of like the real person. Obviously Einstein was dead before. Probably before Trump was born, I'm not sure, or at least before he was, an adult and a prominent political figure. So Einstein never had the opportunity to form an opinion about Trump, but you can like, a human who like reads Einstein's writings and biographies of him and so on, you can sort of extrapolate from his stated political positions and so on to like what he might have thought of Donald Trump, and make a sort of reasonable assessment. But this is what would have happened if this counterfactual was realized, whereas the computer is just sort of doing some statistical analyses of the existing text and then producing another text that has like certain statistical relationships with the existing corpus, and it has no actual understanding of what his political positions were, what his personality was, and so on. That the way that a human um, would do that kind of extrapolation. So there's no when you extrapolate to these like situations that are very different from the what is in the corpus that the AI is learning from, then like the ability to make that extrapolation is gets worse and worse the more the more the situation sort of varies from what is depicted in the corpus, or that is connected to the corpus. And yeah, this is a good point that Angus has made in the chat, that like you have these like fictional characters in a novel, for example, and if it's a good novel, some you have these characters, Sherlock Holmes or something, that like take on a life of their own, long after the author is dead. That like Sherlock Holmes is sort of as much of a person in a certain sense as, say, Julius Caesar, who was a real person that existed in a certain time and place. Whereas, of course, Sherlock Holmes never existed in that sense, but like this sort of personality that was created by an author, this fictional personality, is now like sort of has a life, in a sense that is sort of, it is kind of endowed with a life by all the people that have wrote subsequent stories about Sherlock Holmes, or depicted Sherlock Holmes in TV and movies and so on. Whereas like even if you sort of give ChatGPT the prompt, like answer me as if you were Sherlock Holmes, and you have a conversation with it, it's not especially convincing. Most of the time, it just sort of gives like it's kind of like a sort of not very good like pastiche. So you might imagine like a, I don't know, first year English student writing. When they're sort of approaching the deadline and don't have much time to do anything better than this like very superficial copy. So yeah, there's like a difference between this human production of I guess this creative production that a human is capable of producing essentially a personality, producing a fictional person that other people can actually uh, bring to life, or continue the life of after the author's death, versus this sort of artificial simulacrum of a person that you can get through ChatGPT or similar tools, that can only really sort of operate based on like a limited corpus, and will start doing things that are like extremely incorrect or inappropriate as soon as you start to depart from the domain that it is connected to through that corpus. So yeah, there's still that empirical gap between what humans are capable of doing and what the even fairly sophisticated AI systems are capable of doing. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. I think we're at the top of 44, right? Another conceivable method. Oh no, sorry, you read that one, didn't you?
Yeah.
Are we at the next one we have thought of?
I can't remember.
Okay, I'll just start from there.
Wait, I think it's we have thought.
Okay, yeah, I'll start from there. And it's not a big deal if we reread something we read before. Okay. We have thought of still other methods, in particular those that equip Grey-Walter's tortoise with the capacity to learn, namely the learning represented by the well-known process, quote, the burnt hand is afraid of the fire, unquote. We can put a fuse on the approach circuit of the tortoise. If it makes contact with a burning object, the fuse melts and breaks the circuit of the approach mechanism, and another backup mechanism comes into action. If the tortoise crashes into the burning object too often and too violently, the effects of the shocks can be accumulated, for example, on an irreversible spring mechanism, which eventually triggers a device for bypassing the obstacles without touching them. However, it is apparent that in these methods, the learning is quote-unquote cheating. They only work once and are anticipated by the constructor. They are quote-unquote cheating, like the pseudo-intelligent acts of a trained animal. Shannon, among many others, is currently trying to solve the problem of the automatic telephone's learning to make more frequent calls. To begin, he has very recently focused on a, quote, automatic mouse, unquote, that, quote unquote, learns a maze. It first wanders the maze, groping around, and only arrives at the end after a lot of trial and error. But since the device is endowed with a memory, if we then put the mouse back at the starting point, it arrives at the end without error. Before Shannon, Albert Ducrot had made a similar device. The problem of automatic learning is thus apparently solved, but this is only apparent. The mouse is guided by a control mechanism with which a pre-established program conducts a systematic exploration of the maze, which is divided into squares. An automatic memory records the success in each of the squares and the order of these squares. The memory can then serve as a program for the following performance of the device, which guides the magnetic mouse without error. It is obviously not a question of learning, but of mechanical memory, the possibility of which is not denied by anyone. Doubtless we will soon achieve other impressive imitations of learning, as we have achieved impressive imitations of perception. But imitation alone is not interesting. What would count would be an authentic, quote-unquote, model of the phenomenon. The theory of learning is, along with the theory of universals, the weakest part of cybernetics. Experimental psychology has demonstrated that learning clearly involves something other than the implementation of functioning, or even the assembly of new nervous circuits, or the reorganization of the perceptual field according to the laws of common, that is, macroscopic dynamics. Animal learning, as has been demonstrated, notably by E.S. Russell, always takes place on the ground of an instinctive Umwelt and is part of an oriented and quote-unquote co-native activity which aims at the satisfaction of a need. The animal puts the accent of quote-unquote value or quote-unquote importance on some detail that it first ignored. Quote, success, however achieved, directs the animal's attention to the significant features of the perceptual fields, those which are significant as means to the end pursued. There seems to be missing close quotation here. Not sure where exactly it's supposed to be. Okay, open quotes. The perceptual field is organized with respect to these significant features, and when the same situation is presented again, the field retains its special organization. The animal sees it again in this special way. It is therefore able to repeat the solution, for it now perceives the situation in the light of its first success. End quote. In short, cybernetics misses the point of learning as it does of the universal, because in both cases it is impossible to imitate meaning mechanically. On the other hand, finally, the interpretations of learning proposed by Wiener would, strictly speaking, only take into account reflexes learned, quote, in response, unquote, and not, quote unquote, operant reflexes, to use Skinner's terminology. With the automaton, the response that is learned would always be consistent with the response that is not learned. But the animal often changes its method in the process of learning. It attempts some different operations when the first have failed. For example, the cat pulls instead of pushing. The monkey that can no longer find the stick tries to break the bars of the cage or begs the caretaker. From this point of view, the schemas of Gray Walter would appear to have the advantage over Wiener's. This is because the automata, once perfected with some filing mechanisms, moves from one process to another by putting a process that has failed out of operation. But this advantage is only apparent. In an electrical installation, we can easily predict the automatic starting of an auxiliary motor in the case of the primary motor breaking down. No one, however, would be tempted to speak of the learning of an electrical power station. In the Nividic lighthouse, which does not have a caretaker, a siren automatically replaces the light in the case of fog, and a flare gun automatically replaces the siren if it stops sounding. But no one speaks of learning in this case any more than they would for the automatic telephone message, quote, please refer to the new telephone directory, unquote. Truth be told, the cyberneticians could respond then that an organism also possesses a limited repertoire of possible operations. The cat can only chew, scratch, push, pull, or meow. Indeed, animal learning usually consists of calling successively on virtual activities that a state of alert sets in motion. But for man, at least, the new operations possible are indefinite in number. Let us consider, for example, the variety of means a person who is cold can use to warm themselves. Go for a run, put on some warmer clothes, go to bed, buy an electric radiator, do Swedish gymnastics, prepare some hot tea, drink alcohol, go to the cinema, take the subway, eat more food, go to the south, use the Coué method, auto-suggestion, and so forth. I don't know what the Coué method is. It sounds like some kind of like self-hypnosis or something. I'm not sure. And I'm also not sure what Swedish gymnastics are in relation to other kinds of gymnastics. Maybe these are like 1950s like pop culture things that are not obvious to 2024 readers. But yeah, so the sort of general idea in this passage, I think, is like what we've been talking about, this sort of open-ended nature of human learning in opposition to the like sort of fixed repertoire, even of these more sophisticated, forms of learning that you might imagine that these machines would be capable of doing. So like yeah, you have this thermostat, for example, that measures the temperature in the room and turns on the furnace. Obviously, this is a very simple mechanism. You can imagine a more sophisticated one where like maybe it can check whether the furnace has actually turned on or not, and if the furnace is not working, it will send a message to the repair company that will come and fix the furnace. Or if that message to the repair company is not received, maybe it will put in an order on Amazon to buy a space heater. Or you can imagine more and more complicated like contingency plans. But it would still be like a limited stock that like once you go through plans A through X, for example, then it just has no more options they can try. Whereas a human could, in principle, decide I'm gonna, break my table and use it as firewood. I'm going to, buy a plane ticket to go to the Caribbean, or any number of different things to solve the problem of being too cold, the human being doesn't have like a fixed stock of potential solutions to the cold problem. The human can actually invent a solution that is not sort of pre-given, um, and yeah. So I think what Ruyer wants to sort of insist on is that even these more and more sophisticated, you know, uh, supposed learning processes in machines are still just sort of like a fixed stock of solutions or potential solutions to a problem, and you sort of miss that open-ended capacity for learning and invention, which is sort of continuous with learning in the case of human beings. And so yeah, the and of course he's not going to deny that humans do have like this sort of preset repertoire of solutions to a problem. Like if you're in your apartment and you realize it's too cold, you don't have to sort of invent a new solution each time this problem happens. You like first go to the thermostat and turn the temperature up. Like this is sort of like this is a kind of a mechanistic response that you have learned, that you have this like acquired habit that like if it's too cold, turn the thermostat up. But if you sort of notice that the thermostat says it's set to 25, but it's still freezing in this room, then you would like I don't know, call the super of the building or like check if your space heater is working, or you would like improvise in response to the failure of your first sort of preset solution, whereas the thermostat only has this fixed repertoire, of potential responses to the solution, and then once it exhausts that repertoire, it just has no way of handling the situation. So it's sort of open-ended capacity to learn and improvise and invent is sort of the in principle difference between human grasp of a situation and sort of understanding in relation to a value of some kind. In this case, the value of you could say comfort or not being cold or something like that. As opposed to the machine has just this like pre-built stock of responses that could be an extensive list of alternate solutions if the first one doesn't work, but still at some point that set of solutions will run out, and then it will just be ineffective at solving this problem.
One of the things that I've found striking about this book is, I mean, obviously a lot of the empirical arguments he makes are very outdated, and there's been a lot of technological development since 1956 or whenever it was, or even 67, I think was the second edition. But we've been able to find applications for a lot of these major points that he makes. In his criticisms of mechanistic cybernetics to contemporary technology as well. I think that before starting the book, I assumed that it would be a lot more difficult to apply it to kind of contemporary technological. I do think that technological development has blunted the force of some of these arguments, but I guess I'm just impressed that many of them still hold up, even if they have to be like schematized to fit contemporary technology.
Yeah, I remember when we were like discussing what to read next after we finished the Merleau-Ponty book, and we were talking about this one, and you had asked me about like how much relevance it had to like contemporary AI topics, and I said probably not that much, because cybernetics was kind of a competitor to like the AI program of research, and kind of like an alternate path that ended up not really being followed after I don't know, maybe the 1960s. But I think I was probably wrong about that. Wrong about that because yeah, a lot of the sort of contemporary wave of AI stuff has to do with the machine learning systems that are much more relevant to the kinds of things he was talking about than say like the like 1980s rules based AI would have been. And I think to some extent the fact that this rules based AI turned out not to be very workable is kind of evidence for his position or supports his position that like so like to give a bit of background here. So like the more rules-based system would be like you would sort of build an AI system by having explicit rules like pre-programmed that like so like you had like chess playing computers, for example. You would like actually give it the rules of chess, and you would give it like principles for like how to like chess strategy, like don't lose pieces if you can avoid it or something. Obviously more detailed than that, but like you would give it sort of like a set of explicit rules that would follow. And one of the sort of major problems that came up with this was that came up with this approach was what was known as the frame problem, which is that like any sort of explicit set of rules that you can give to an AI system to like handle a certain situation will always sort of presuppose like a background or a frame understanding of things that are not specified by those rules. And so like you would have things like trying to get this AI system to understand like a very simple narrative about like a kid's birthday party. But the if you don't like specify, oh, the cake didn't like explode, or let like the chairs didn't float up into the ceiling. If you don't like explicitly tell the computer that, then it doesn't know whether the cake exploded or not. So obviously a human with like some familiarity with the physics of cakes and chairs will just assume that the cake did not spontaneously explode, um, uh, unless you like sort of tell them that the cake did explode, and then the person would probably ask questions about like what this cake was made of. Um, but the AI system has no like grasp of the physics of cakes unless you build that in. And so like and of course like you could say like, oh, okay, we need to add cake physics to our AI system, but then what about the table? Did the table explode? Or like that any you could have a million different unlikely circumstances that you have to tell the AI didn't happen. And so like it's impossible to sort of explicitly write down here's all the knowledge that you need to know about like the way that the world works to be able to understand like what a kid's birthday party story like looks like, and answer basic questions about this story about the story. So I think so this like in the sort of 1980s, like as this problem started to become more like as the awareness of this problem started to be more prominent, and like the lack of a prospect for solving this problem just by sort of making building in more background knowledge about cakes not exploding and so on. So as this problem started to become more like obviously intractable, there was like what is commonly referred to as the AI winter, where like all this funding that like especially military bodies in the U.S. were providing, and other government bodies, companies, and universities and so on. Like the fact that there was this pretty limited prospect of success led to them sort of pulling a lot of the funding. And then it was only when you started to have like in the late 80s, I guess, and then into the 90s, there was more focus on at the time it was known as like parallel distributed processing. So this is like the sort of neural net architecture, where you would, rather than sort of giving a set of rules that say like if the shape has such and such properties, then the image is a cat. You would instead just sort of feed it a bunch of images of cats, and with a label saying this is a cat, and then a bunch of other images with a label saying this is not a cat. And you would allow the system to like set the parameters of these different supposed neurons, these units that would result in being able to identify images of cats and distinguish them from non-cats. So you, as a human researcher, you don't have to be able to explain what makes an image look like a cat, or how you can identify a cat from an image. You just sort of feed all these images labeled cat or not cat, and you allow the AI or this machine learning system to learn how to identify cats. And what is also, in some cases kind of disturbing about these systems is that as a researcher, you don't even necessarily know how the system has learned to identify cats. You just sort of can measure that it has a certain accuracy at measuring at identifying cats from images, but you can't sort of look at the system and say, oh, it's like it's looking at the shape or the color or whatever. You don't know what it is that the system is actually picking up on to identify cats from non-cats. And of course, this is a very simple sort of image recognition task, but of course you have much more complicated systems where making a decision in one way or another could have pretty serious consequences for people. That like I know in the U.S. a lot of states use similar types of systems for like bail decisions. That like, is this person someone we can trust to release on bail or not? Or yeah, in healthcare, so like should this insurance claim be accepted or not? So like they're sort of taking in information about the person and coming up with a sort of yes or no decision. Can we release this person on bail? Yes or no, or whatever. And big surprise, it often ends up being sort of like a proxy. Like the system essentially learns to be racist. That like it uses zip code or something like that as a sort of proxy for the race of the person that is potentially up for bail, and it ends up denying bail or recommending that people be denied bail at a much higher rate if the person is black than if they're white. And so yeah, so it's not that anyone sort of told the system denied bail to black people, but it has learned to reproduce the existing racism in the legal system and generate the same sort of racist pattern. And yeah, without anyone actually sort of explicitly telling it to do that. And so these cases are like maybe relatively easy to identify because you can actually just sort of count the number of people that, or like look at the outcomes. But there are much less obvious cases where you have like in the financial system, something a transaction getting flagged as fraud or potential fraud or whatever, based on all kinds of factors that you are not even aware of, or like you you submit an insurance claim and it gets denied, but it's that could be based on I don't know who you're friends with on Facebook, or like where your car was tracked to have gone, or like all sorts of things that you would never think are relevant to your insurance claim. But like just this sort of churn of data has like brought in all these different factors and identified that a person who like I don't know posts pictures of cakes that don't explode on Instagram is like X% more likely to submit a fraudulent insurance claim for healthcare services. And so your insurance claim gets flagged as potentially fraudulent because of something you posted on Instagram 5 years ago, or I don't know, like these random things that you would normally not think are at all relevant.
Yeah, on the the point about the image recognition AIs, I think Ruyer would probably feel validated by the fact that even though they are much better than like old-fashioned AI at recognizing images. As we've talked about in this group, like CAPTCHA images, which are used to ensure that a person accessing a website is a person and not a machine. Where you select pictures of bicycles, for instance, from like somewhat unusual angles, or their pictures. They're not. It's never like difficult to tell that it's a bus, for instance, or a bicycle, or a crosswalk. But it is still difficult for like image recognition AIs to determine that these are pictures of bicycles or crosswalks or whatever. And that does seem to indicate that there's still, at least in some situations, this recognition of universals problem.
Yeah, and there was of course there was that infamous case of the Tesla that someone was putting on autopilot, as Tesla likes to market it as, that drove into the side of a truck that was like sort of crashed and was like perpendicular to the road, just because this the training data of the autopilot system had never like included a truck blocking the road, and so the car just had no reason to like identify that this is an obstacle that you should not drive into, and it just drove right into it. Yeah, I think the capture thing is interesting too, because it seems like in the last couple of years they've gotten increasingly difficult. Where of course you still have those like more straightforward ones where it's like identify a crosswalk that are not that hard. But then I got one recently that was like a bunch of like grainy pictures of animals, and then it was like click the animals that have the same coat as this example image, and it was like a deer and a tiger, and then there were a bunch of fish, and like I sort of had to guess, like I guess they mean fur is like what they mean by has the same coat, and yeah, it was very weird. But yeah, so some of them are getting like harder and involve more, I guess, like semantics than just so a crosswalk. Like there have been some cases of or like some sort of benchmark examples where you have an AI image recognition system that was able to beat certain CAPTCHA like systems that are in place now, but like so these ones like identify the animal that has the same coat, and is I've gotten pretty often these ones where it's like identify the animal that is in the same position as the example animal, so either like standing or sitting or whatever. So here you have to not just recognize the word crosswalk and then identify images that have a crosswalk in them, but you have to like I guess have a semantic understanding of what it means for an animal to be standing or sitting, and then identify that like a sitting goat is in the same position as a sitting dog, and sort of yeah, so use this more like semantic grasp of a situation as opposed to just identifying the meaning of a word and tagging the image that corresponds to that word. So yeah, I think it's likely that like yeah, this sort of basic image recognition of crosswalks, even from different angles and grainy photos and so on, is going to increasingly is going to get better and better, probably pretty quickly over the next few years. And then we're going to see the CAPTCHA moving more towards some kind of semantic understanding. Obviously not like super sophisticated, but like at least being able to grasp that a sitting goat is the same posture as a sitting dog or whatever. And then maybe eventually we'll get to the point where we have to read a story about a kid's birthday party and answer whether the cake has exploded, as a test of whether it's a human or not. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so like sort of I guess the like message that we can draw from this sort of like process is that this sort of open-ended learning capacity that humans have is still sort of in practical use to distinguish humans from AI systems as they exist today, where like you can ask a human to like look at these weird grainy photos or like letters that have lines through them and are at different angles and so on, and humans can still figure out how to do this in a way that the computer vision system that was trained on like normal text with the letters in normal positions and not having lines through them and so on, is not capable of sort of extrapolating from that knowledge, and so like a human learns not just like this sort of statistical pattern of dark versus light on a page, but sort of grasps the shape of a letter and is capable of recognizing that shape even when it is in like a different orientation or is obscured by lines and so on. So the human is sort of extracting something from the training or the input that it receives by reading a bunch of text that the computer is still not capable of extracting at this point. I was joking with a friend a while ago about like how I wanted to like write a science fiction story where like the AI apocalypse comes about through like increasingly sophisticated CAPTCHA processes as opposed to like the Terminator thing where AI decides to like kill all humans or something. It would be like input the nuclear launch codes to prove that you're a human being or something. Okay, so yeah, we reached the end of this chapter, and we're sort of approaching the end of the allotted time for this meeting as well. So yeah, we can end here and pick up at the beginning of chapter 2. So yeah, we'll be talking about framing activities and framed mechanisms. So this is like one of the sort of central arguments that he has made already in this book that we're going to look at in more detail, is the fact that all these sort of mechanisms and these machine learning processes and so on are set up with like a certain set of parameters by a human. The human sort of frames the system and says like it will take images as input and produce this kind of output, like a label cat or not cat. And of course, if you input a music file, it will give you an error message or make a very strange determination of whether this piece of music is a cat or not. But it won't give like a a good response to this input of music. So like this sort of framing of the problem to be solved is performed by the human, and then the mechanism, no matter how sophisticated, has to operate within that frame. Okay. Yeah. So we'll talk about that next week. So yeah, thanks everyone for your participation this week, and yeah, hope to see you next week.